Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to discuss Nixon's foreign and domestic policy, including his trip to China and Watergate. So, Nixon in the 1970s introduces environmental reforms, which we've talked about. Along with that, he took foreign affairs in a new direction. As a presidential candidate, he wants to end the war in Vietnam. He also recognizes the rising power of the Soviet Union, and basically the United States, because of Vietnam, doesn't want to pay the cost of continuing communism everywhere. He develops a new approach to the Cold War, which we're going to talk about right now. Basically, his leading authority and advisor on international affairs, his name is Henry Kissinger, and he and Nixon alter previous Cold War foreign policies. Let's just take a look. I'll come back to that, but Truman, you could see, remember, was containment, contain communism where it is. Eisenhower was much more aggressive. Kennedy wanted to be able to respond to communism in different ways. Johnson in the Vietnam War wanted a combination of domino theory and containment. Nixon's is called realpolitik and détente. So if you see here, realpolitik is German for real politics. This means that political goals shouldn't be defined by whether or not a country is communism or communist or not. It should be defined by national interests. So both China and the Soviet Union, even though they are great communist powers, they have the potential to become great trading partners despite being communist. And again, there are the foreign policy reviews. And realpolitik basically changes Cold War assumptions starting in the 1970s. Nixon starts to realize that there is no worldwide communist movement directed by the Soviets. There are different types of communism in different countries. So, for example, there's unique ideologies and flavors of communism, if you will, in the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Yugoslavia. They're all unique. And so we don't realize this until after the Vietnam War. And Nixon steadfastly believes that foreign policy needs to be flexible and avoid ideological absolutes. So he's a hardliner. He has been. He was Eisenhower's vice president, but he reaches out to China. We don't officially recognize the mainland China. The China that we recognize is exiled on the island of Taiwan. Nixon realizes this can't go on much longer. They're the most populous nation on earth. And he realizes the benefits of reaching out to China, which we'll talk about in a second. He aims at peaceful relations with the Soviets and other communist countries in Asia by engaging in ping-pong diplomacy, which means that China accepts our invitation, or they invite the U.S. ping-pong team to compete in China, which is what Forrest Gump was on, and that's what the ping-pong was all about. But it means they're open to talks. Here are the benefits and drawbacks of establishing a relationship with China. The pros: it could create a stronger front against the Soviets or drive a wedge in between the Soviets and the Chinese, strengthen our economic ties, allows people to travel to China now, and then it forms a stronger bond between East and West, and we can have greater cultural exchange students going there to study, students coming here to study at American universities. The cons are it upsets our anti-communist American allies in NATO. It increases tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, all but temporarily, and it creates a rift between the United States and China over the political status of Taiwan, not to mention Taiwan is upset with us themselves. So in 1972, Nixon visits China. He visits the historic sites. He talks with the Chinese premier in Laos and the Communist Party, Mao Zedong, and tourists follow, and normalized relations were completed between the two countries. By 1978 and 1979, they begin formally recognizing one another. Between the U.S. and Soviets, we start a policy of détente, which is French, and it means relaxing tensions, easing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and it replaces the previous policies of suspicion and distrust. It means we're going to try to work with the Soviets rather than working to defeat them. This, the leader now, instead of the former leader, whose name is escaping me at the moment, Khrushchev, it's now Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev invites Nixon to Moscow because he fears that if the United States and China become best buddies, then they're going to be isolated. So he invites Nixon to Moscow, and they talk things out, and eventually they sign the first ever Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or the SALT I, because there is a SALT II that's written later. What it does, the main thing you need to know, is that it freezes the deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles and limited the ABMs, but it does not end the stockpiling of MIRVs, which are the most dangerous weapons we have. It's like multiple missiles inside a missile. So you fire one missile, then the missiles fire out of that missile and hit multiple targets at once. It doesn't end the arms race, but it's a good step forward. Because of these things, you can see the entire map for the presidential election of 1972 is red. He only loses one state and Washington, D.C. to George McGovern. He wins in a landslide. He claims that he is speaking for the silent majority, or those in middle America, the people who are the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators, the factory owners, the people who get up and go to work every day and do what they're supposed to. One of his domestic programs is called New Federalism. Federalism is the sharing of power between the states and the federal government, but lately it's been tipping in the federal government's favor. They have a lot of authority due to court decisions and things like the Civil War and the Great Depression, New Deal. He wanted to start revenue sharing programs where he would give money to the states and then the states would run these social programs. But at the same time, instead of giving power to the states, he also expands the government's role in daily society. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration makes sure people are safe at work. The Drug Enforcement Administration continues the war on drugs. The EPA, he also expands Medicare and Social Security. Here are some of the federal agencies established under Nixon. We've talked about the EPA, OSHA, and now the Drug Enforcement Administration. You can see today they have a budget of $2.02 billion and 5,000 agents. During the 1970s, due to the enormous spending of the Vietnam War, we come to a problem that we've never had before called stagflation. And it's the combination of the words stagnation and inflation. It's rising inflation coupled with stagnation. Stagnation is slow economic growth and rising unemployment. So rising unemployment plus rising inflation equals stagflation. And these things were thought in economic theory not to happen together, but because of the oil crisis, which we'll talk about in a second, and the large Vietnam War budget and the rising competition for jobs, it happens. And it makes the economy a mess in the 1970s. OPEC is in charge, basically, of the majority of the world's oil. They're a conglomerate. They're a cartel, basically. They're mostly made up of Arab nations. And the U.S., throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is becoming more and more dominated by suburbs. So, in turn, more oil is needed to heat homes and power our cars. So oil becomes a great way for these smaller third world countries to influence larger, more powerful nations. And in 1973, just on the other side of the world, the Arabs and Israelis get into the Yom Kippur War. And Arab nations attack Israel, which is our ally. We believe Israel has a right to exist. We fought for their creation after World War II. But Israel, because of our support, stomps these Arab nations. And so in response to our support for Israel, the Arab OPEC nations create an embargo on oil to the United States and other allies, which means that there's a supply shock. It doesn't gradually go down. It goes down all at once, and there's no more oil. So oil prices skyrocket, and there's long lines at gas stations, and it creates an energy crisis in the 1970s, which we'll get to a little bit more in the next lesson. So to help fight some of these economic problems, Nixon ends the Bretton Woods system of money management that's been done throughout the world for years, decades, a century at least. He basically takes the United States off the gold standard. Remember, our money was tied to gold prices, but we're no longer going to do that. So the United States has what's called fiat money, which is money because we put faith in it. So your dollar isn't worth anything besides the fact that people will accept it. He also places a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices, and these things work well in the short term, but the economy tanks in the late 1970s under Ford and Carter. As far as civil rights goes with Nixon, he does something called his Southern strategy, and politically this is brilliant. He wants to win support from traditional Democratic voting citizens, blue-collar workers, and Southern whites. Southern whites who have been upset since the Civil War about integration and giving up slavery. They've always voted Democrat because the Republicans were the party that freed the slaves. So he does this by calling for a freeze on court-ordered busing and makes some conservative white Southerners judges. And the court-ordered busing means that we would take Carroll High School, a mostly white population. In order to increase our racial diversity, we would bus in black students from another neighborhood. And this was controversial, and people didn't like it, and so Nixon calls for a stop to it, and that is whites like that. But he also is a proponent of affirmative action, which is a policy that gives special consideration to women and minorities in places like education and employment. And it's supposed to make up for past discrimination, so minorities like this. So he's playing to both sides at once, which politically is brilliant. And then finally we get to his Watergate problem. Watergate is the general term for the series of scandals involving Nixon. It's named after the hotel complex where 5 men break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters because they're Republican, they're looking for secrets, Forrest Gump catches them, and just kidding. So all 5 men who were caught trying to steal information were indicted by the grand jury. 7 men were members of CREEP, or the Committee to Re-elect the President. So what can we do to get the president reelected? This scandal reveals the existence of a White House dirty tricks squad, where they were doing illegal things to gain an advantage. The plumbers were men who plugged these political leaks. There's an enemies list. Nixon kept a list of his enemy, and the goal is to sabotage Nixon's enemies. So the U.S. Senate sets up a committee to investigate this. They uncover the connection between the break-in and CREEP. And 2 Washington Post reporters made famous by this, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, begin to uncover and reveal that knowledge of this break-in goes as deep as the FBI, CIA, Justice Department, and even Nixon himself. Their source of information is an anonymous informant named Deep Throat. And only was it revealed in 2005 that after his death that it was the deputy director of the FBI. And so another Senate committee is set up to investigate the White House staff themselves. In an unrelated scandal, Spiro Agnew, his vice president, has to resign. And the 25th Amendment, which was passed in the late 50s, early 60s, it says that if the vice president cannot fulfill his duty, the president can pick a new one with congressional approval. It also sets out the succession of the presidency. We'll talk about that later. This new Senate committee that is investigating reveals that there's a recording system in the White House. So this committee subpoenas Nixon for the tapes. He refuses, citing something called executive privilege, stating the president has the right to keep certain information confidential if it's in the interest of national security. Well, the Watergate scandal, later on, he has to dismiss Archibald Cox, who was his Solicitor General, and he also accepts the resignation of the Attorney General because he wouldn't do what he wanted, and the Deputy Attorney General. And Nixon refuses to hand over these tapes because he claims he's innocent. But he eventually released edited portions of the tapes, and he says the edited portions are crucial to national security. The case eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it is revealed in U.S. versus Nixon. They holds that the claims of executive privilege over the tapes are void. So Nixon hands over the tapes, the content is revealed, Congress begins to think about impeaching the president. And impeachment is simply bringing an officer up on charges for conduct committed while in office. It's not throwing him out, it's bringing an elected official up on charges. And so Nixon learns that he will be impeached. It's inevitable. And so on August 8th, 1974, Nixon announces he will resign the next day, and Vice President Gerald Ford will become the next president. Nixon is the only president to ever resign. This is a huge political scandal that runs to the deepest parts of the government. Basically, the American people don't trust the government anymore because we are being defeated in Vietnam. We have been defeated in Vietnam by this point. We have a weakening international economic position, and there's increasing social conflict within the United States. Still today, stemming from Watergate, there's a lack of trust between politicians and the people. And we always name stuff Gate, Pardon Gate, Lawyer Gate, Deflate Gate. That wasn't even political. And then here are some reforms. I would focus on the Federal Election Campaign Act amendments because that was part of the illegal stuff that was going on during Watergate. That's all I have for you today. I know it was quite a bit, but Nixon is a complicated administration. And I will see you back here in class with your learning targets. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.